Imagine the sound of warning sirens echoing near the borders of Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire, not because of an attack that has already begun, but because of the fear that one could come at any moment. The tension is real and it is growing. In just a few months, Côte d'Ivoire will hold its presidential election, a moment that should symbolize democracy and civic choice. But instead, for millions of people, including the vast Burkinabé diaspora living inside Côte d'Ivoire, it feels like waiting for a storm. President Ibrahim Traoré did not hide his words when he spoke about this. He made it clear that his problem is not with the Ivorian people, but with leaders he accuses of sheltering pain and even protecting those who destabilize Burkina Faso. His language was blunt, almost shocking. They are there displayed, protected, paid, and well-lodged. For a revolutionary leader who believes in rupture rather than hypocrisy, this was not a statement meant to smooth things over. It was a warning. And the stakes are high. If Côte d'Ivoire becomes unstable during its elections, the violence could spill over, igniting the entire region. If leaders continue, as Traoré claims, to flirt with terrorists, then the risk is not just political rivalry, it is national collapse. In his words, if this country loses what it gains, it will be attacked and it will sink. For Americans who remember the civil wars of the past decades, this is not just rhetoric. It is a chilling reminder of how fragile peace can be when power games are played with human lives. So the question must be asked, can West Africa survive another political firestorm? Or are we already watching the sparks fall? Can President Ibrahim Traoré's uncompromising stand protect his people and perhaps even Côte d'Ivoire itself from sliding into chaos? Please share your thoughts below if you believe this truth deserves to be heard. And subscribe if you know that Africa's future must not be written by outsiders, but by the people who live and fight for it. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré speaks, he rarely hides behind diplomatic language. His words are sharp, often uncomfortable, but they are intended to cut through layers of silence that many in the region have grown too used to. And in this interview, when asked about Côte d'Ivoire, he did exactly that. He began by recalling the early days of his leadership. On September 30th, the very day he rose to power, one of the first phone calls he received was from the Ivorian president. A gesture of fraternity, followed by visits from his younger brother, seemed to set the tone for a neighborly relationship. At that time, many believed Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire were moving closer together. Traoré himself admitted, yes, we can say the relations were good, but that promise quickly faded. Why, according to Traoré, it was because Côte d'Ivoire wanted Burkina Faso to follow a certain direction, a path of compromise, of aligning with policies that did not match the revolutionary spirit of Ouagadougou. For Traoré, who believes that revolution is by definition a rupture, a break with the old order, there could be no middle ground. In his words, we are here for the revolution. And the revolution means rupture. We cannot follow a certain policy that compromises that. As time went on, the relationship soured. He described how individuals and groups who once sought privileges in Burkina Faso but did not obtain them turned against his government. They crossed into Côte d'Ivoire, and there, according to Traoré, they found not just refuge but active protection. They are deployed there. They are maintained. They are secured. We know what we are talking about, and they know what we are talking about. These are not casual accusations. For a sitting head of state to declare openly that his enemies are being sheltered by a neighbor is nothing short of extraordinary. He insisted that Burkina Faso tried to follow all proper channels. They filed complaints, issued mandates, and appealed to Ivorian authorities to act. We spoke to them several times. They told us we had to follow the rules of law to issue judicial warrants. Burkina did so. But nothing happened. They did not respond. Traoré said his frustration visible. And then came the moment that changed the tone of the interview completely. When pressed by journalists, are you telling us that Côte d'Ivoire is serving as a rear base for organizations aiming to destabilize Burkina Faso? Traoré did not hesitate. He leaned in and answered, it's even more than that. He alleged that enemies of Burkina Faso are not only based there, but also paid, protected, and well-lodged. This was the first major revelation of the exchange, the claim that a neighboring state is actively supporting destabilization efforts against another. For a region still scarred by wars, coups, and foreign interventions, this accusation carried enormous weight. It was no longer a story of silent tensions or misunderstandings. It was a declaration of betrayal. But Traoré did not stop there. He connected this accusation to an even larger danger: terrorism. He suggested that the Ivorian government, far from fighting extremists, has chosen to live under a non-aggression pact with them. His words were biting. Do you really believe the Ivorian army is so powerful that terrorists see them and decide not to touch them? No, it's false. There is a pact of non-aggression. The implication was terrifying. If true, it means a national army, instead of defending its people, is coexisting with forces that have killed thousands across the Sahel. And for Traoré, the consequence was clear. If this country loses what it gains, it will be attacked by terrorists. It will sink. Here, the story shifts from politics to survival. This is no longer about diplomatic disagreements between neighbors. It is about the possibility of an entire country collapsing under the weight of choices made by its leaders. For millions of ordinary Ivorians and for the vast Burkinabé diaspora that has lived and worked in Côte d'Ivoire for decades, the threat feels immediate. The memories of past violence, the 2002 Civil War, the bloody post-election crisis of 2010-2011 still haunt the collective mind. Many remember refugees crossing borders, villages burned, and families divided. By placing Côte d'Ivoire's upcoming presidential election in this context, Traoré raised the stakes even further. He made it clear that Burkina Faso has an interest not in interfering with the vote itself, but in preventing the violence that might erupt from it. We have many compatriots in Côte d'Ivoire, he said. We fear there will be violence, and that is not welcome because we ourselves have lived through such violence before. For Americans watching from afar, this may feel like a familiar pattern, a neighbor's politics spilling over into another country, threatening to destabilize an entire region. It happened in the Balkans in the 1990s, it happened in Central America, and in Africa it has happened more times than most would like to remember. What Ibrahim Traoré revealed in these opening exchanges was not just his distrust of Ivorian leaders, but his deep conviction that Burkina Faso cannot and will not compromise on its revolutionary path. We cannot be in a revolution and want another model of diplomacy, he insisted. The message was simple: Burkina Faso will choose rupture even if it comes at the cost of diplomatic isolation. And so the first act of this drama closes with the stage set Côte d'Ivoire on the eve of elections, accused of harboring enemies and flirting with terrorists. Burkina Faso warning that such choices could bring collapse, and a region once again bracing for the possibility of violence. The interview reached its breaking point when a journalist asked the most sensitive question: are you suggesting that Côte d'Ivoire today serves as a rear base for organizations destabilizing Burkina Faso? The room fell quiet. It was a question that most leaders would avoid, deflect, or bury under polite diplomacy. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not most leaders. He leaned forward and without hesitation delivered a thunderclap. It's even more than that. In that instant, the temperature of the conversation changed. What had begun as a tense but measured exchange became an outright accusation. Traoré declared that Burkina Faso's enemies were not only present in Côte d'Ivoire, but were displayed, protected, paid, and well-lodged. He spoke not with the vagueness of speculation, but with the certainty of someone who had been watching for years. And he reminded the journalists that Ouagadougou had already tried every official channel: diplomatic notes, judicial mandates, requests for extradition, only to be met with silence. We did everything he said. They did not respond. This was the emotional climax of the interview, the unveiling of what Traoré described as betrayal at the highest level. For him, the issue was not simply neglect or miscommunication. It was complicity, and that he warned put Côte d'Ivoire itself in grave danger. He then drew a connection that many in the region whisper about, but few dare to say openly: the link between state authorities and terrorist groups. The power flirts with the terrorists, he said bluntly. His voice carried the weight of battlefield experience. For nearly a decade, Burkina Faso has bled from jihadist attacks, losing soldiers, villages, and entire communities. To Traoré, the idea that a neighboring government could coexist peacefully with such groups was intolerable, and he pushed the argument even further. Do you believe the Ivorian army is so powerful that when terrorists see them, they simply decide not to attack? His rhetorical question cut deep, exposing what he saw as a false narrative. No, he answered himself. It's false. There is a pact of non-aggression. The warning was stark: if Côte d'Ivoire stopped providing whatever benefit it gives these groups, then the country itself would be attacked and it would collapse. The country will sink, Traoré said, without softening the blow. For a nation that still bears the scars of two civil wars in recent memory, the word sink was not just dramatic, it was chilling. At this point, the reaction inside the room was palpable. Journalists shifted, some scribbled quickly, others looked stunned. The audience knew they were witnessing a statement that would ripple far beyond Ouagadougou. A head of state was openly accusing another government not of negligence, but of treachery. And yet Traoré did not stop at condemnation. He also sought to explain why Burkina Faso had chosen a harder, lonelier road. "We cannot be in a revolution and want another model of diplomacy," he said. For him, diplomacy built on hypocrisy, smiles in front of microphones, reassurances that everything is fine, was itself a form of betrayal. Real diplomacy, he insisted, must be rooted in truth, even if that truth is harsh. If something is wrong, we must have the courage to say it. This uncompromising stance is part of why he remains both admired and feared. For his supporters, Traoré's frankness is refreshing in a region where leaders often hide behind polite words while their countries burn. For his critics, it is reckless, a path that could isolate Burkina Faso and invite retaliation. But either way, the message was clear: the revolution in Burkina Faso would not bend to the old rules. The conversation then turned to the people most at risk, the Burkinabé diaspora in Côte d'Ivoire. With hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of citizens living and working there, the fear of election-related violence looms large. Traoré admitted openly that this was a major concern. He recalled past crises, les Opérations Brie, waves of violence that spilled into Burkina Faso, and emphasized that his government did not want history to repeat itself. His concern sounded less like a politician calculating and more like a father worried for his scattered children. Outside the interview room, the reactions spread quickly. In Ouagadougou, supporters praised their president for saying out loud what many suspected but dared not articulate. In Abidjan, officials remained tight-lipped, aware that any direct rebuttal might inflame tensions further. Across West Africa, observers were left wondering, was this the beginning of a dangerous new confrontation or a necessary moment of honesty that could prevent worse outcomes? Even international audiences could not ignore the drama. Western governments, though not directly addressed, heard the subtext: the revolution in Burkina Faso will not be contained by the old diplomatic game. Traoré's voice carried defiance not only toward his neighbor, but toward any power, regional or global, that sought to manipulate events in silence. And so the reaction phase of this interview cemented the stakes. Traoré had laid his cards on the table. He had named Côte d'Ivoire as a base for enemies. He had accused it of dealing with terrorists. He had warned of collapse. And he had declared that Burkina Faso's revolution would not retreat into comfortable lies. For viewers across Africa and for Americans old enough to remember other moments in history where leaders spoke uncomfortable truths, the message was unmistakable. This is not politics as usual. This is the sound of a revolution refusing to bow. When the words of a president strike with such force, their impact is not only diplomatic. They fall directly into the lives of ordinary people. For the millions of Burkinabé living in Côte d'Ivoire, Ibrahim Traoré's warnings sounded less like abstract geopolitics and more like a personal alarm bell. Families who left Burkina Faso decades ago in search of work on cocoa farms or in bustling cities like Abidjan now wonder if their very presence could become a point of tension. Traoré himself admitted this fear openly. "We have many compatriots in Côte d'Ivoire," he said, "and we fear there will be violence." His words were rooted in history. In past decades, Ivorian political crises did not stop at the ballot box. They spilled into the streets. Riots, militias, and brutal reprisals often fell hardest on immigrant communities, especially those from Burkina Faso. For older Ivorians and Burkinabé alike, the memories of the 2002-2007 civil war and the deadly post-election violence of 2010-2011 remain vivid. Thousands were displaced, and too many never returned home. For those living abroad, the diaspora is often a lifeline. Remittances sent back from Côte d'Ivoire keep entire villages in Burkina Faso alive. If instability once again grips Abidjan, that lifeline could be cut. Traoré's fears, therefore, are not only about bullets and bombs, but about the silent devastation of economic collapse, children unable to go to school, farms left without support, households suddenly pushed into poverty. On the political stage, the consequences are equally heavy. By accusing Côte d'Ivoire of harboring enemies and colluding with terrorists, Traoré has essentially declared that traditional diplomacy is broken. In his words, "We cannot be in a revolution and want another model of diplomacy." This was a statement of principle, but it also carried a cost. First, it hardened the split between Ouagadougou and Abidjan. Whatever channels of quiet negotiation still existed are now strained to their limit. The chance for a diplomatic reset seems farther away than ever. Second, it risked polarizing the region itself. If Côte d'Ivoire is seen as aligning against Burkina Faso, then alliances across West Africa could shift dramatically, forcing other governments to choose sides. The civil consequences, however, extend beyond borders. For ordinary Burkinabé back home, hearing their leader describe Côte d'Ivoire as a threat reinforces a siege mentality. It fosters national unity. In the short term, we must defend ourselves because even our neighbors are against us, but it also deepens the sense of isolation. Citizens may feel cut off from opportunities in the region, forced to turn inward at a time when Burkina Faso's economy is already under strain from war and sanctions. There is also the question of truth versus perception. Even if not every accusation is fully verifiable, the very act of making them changes how people behave. Ivorians who once welcomed Burkinabé neighbors may begin to see them with suspicion. Burkinabé living abroad may feel less safe even if violence does not break out. Perception in politics and security can be as powerful as reality. For political elites across the region, Traoré's words are a reminder of the high cost of revolutionary honesty. Unlike leaders who prefer soft words and backroom deals, he has chosen to say aloud what others only whisper. That candor wins admiration among those who long for new leadership in Africa. But it also creates enemies, both visible and hidden, who see his uncompromising approach as a threat to their power. The outcome, therefore, is twofold. On the one hand, Burkina Faso stands taller, prouder, more united, at least for now. On the other hand, the risk to civilians, whether in Abidjan's crowded neighborhoods or in Burkinabé villages that depend on diaspora support, has grown more acute. It is the paradox of revolution. By speaking truth without filter, you empower your people, but you also increase the dangers they must face. And so, as the election in Côte d'Ivoire approaches, the human stakes become clearer. This is not only about borders, armies, or governments. It is about children who may lose fathers to violence, mothers who may lose their livelihoods, and entire communities who may once again find themselves caught between the ambitions of politicians and the brutality of armed groups. In the end, Traoré's decision to speak openly was a political act, but the burden of its consequences will fall first on ordinary people. For Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire alike, the true question is not only about who wins an election or who commands an army. It is whether their people can escape the cycle of fear, betrayal, and collapse that has haunted West Africa for far too long. From Washington to Paris, the words of Ibrahim Traoré did not pass unnoticed. When a head of state accuses a neighbor of sheltering enemies and signing non-aggression pacts with terrorists, diplomats understand immediately this is not just rhetoric, it is a declaration of confrontation. For the United States, the message carries a double edge. On the one hand, American generals and policymakers have long warned that West Africa must avoid militarization. As Traoré himself reminded his audience, a U.S. general once said, "Your countries do not need to be militarized." This statement seen from Ouagadougou is not advice, but paternalism, a call to keep African states weak and dependent on foreign security umbrellas. On the other hand, Washington knows that instability in Côte d'Ivoire could threaten U.S. economic and security interests across the Gulf of Guinea. Cocoa, gold, oil, and trade routes all run through the region. If violence spreads, America cannot ignore it. Europe, too, watches with unease. France, still struggling with the collapse of its influence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger sees Traoré's bluntness as another nail in the coffin of its old order in West Africa. European leaders may dismiss his words as reckless, but their intelligence services quietly admit that his message resonates among ordinary Africans who are tired of hypocrisy and dependency. Globally, the picture is shifting. Russia and China, already cultivating ties with the Sahel states, see opportunity in Traoré's defiance. When he says, "We fight as Burkinabé, we train as Burkinabé," he is not only rejecting Ivorian leadership, but also signaling to the world that Burkina Faso will not remain a client state. For Moscow and Beijing, this is an invitation. For Washington and Brussels, it is a warning. And so, in the eyes of the world, the Côte d'Ivoire-Burkina Faso standoff is no longer a local quarrel. It has become a symbol of Africa's broader struggle, the fight between dependence and sovereignty, between silence and truth. For Americans, especially those who lived through the Cold War, it feels like déjà vu, a new front line where global powers test their will, but this time on African soil, with African leaders setting the terms. The warning from Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not only for Côte d'Ivoire, it is for all of West Africa and perhaps for the entire world. When a nation chooses silence with terrorists, or when leaders choose comfort over courage, the cost is always paid by ordinary people. Burkina Faso has chosen rupture, a revolution that insists on truth no matter how uncomfortable it may be. But the danger is real. If Côte d'Ivoire sinks into post-election violence, if the so-called non-aggression pacts continue, the flames will not stop at its borders. They could sweep across the Sahel, destabilizing an entire generation's hopes for peace and dignity. And beyond Africa, global powers are already circling, calculating their interests, ready to exploit any crack. So the question falls to us: can President Ibrahim Traoré's stance of truth and revolution protect Burkina Faso and perhaps inspire others to rise above fear? Or will the region once again be dragged into chaos designed by both local betrayals and foreign hands? Share this video if you believe the world must hear Africa's voice before it is drowned out by conflict. Subscribe if you know that the truth matters more than the headlines.